Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Media Pit. Today we're gonna do something pretty interesting. I will be comparing two fairly recent DC movies against each other. That being 2022's The Batman and 2019's Joker. I decided on those two in particular because alongside James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, these two films have been the best things that have come out of DC for the last 10, maybe even 15 years. Plus, both of them go for a much darker and grittier and realistic feel. They both focus on aspects of the Batman franchise, and they both have highly artistic and unique qualities to them, which compared to all of the other comic book movies that we see all the time, is very much appreciated. Of course, these elements are rather surface level stuff. If you look a bit closer, these two films are going for pretty different things. However, another, and most likely the biggest reason for this comparison, is that when I got out of the cinema, just having watched The Batman, talking and discussing with my friends, we very quickly came to that exact question. Which one of these films is actually the better one? Right off the bat, a few disclaimers. These films are very different. It's not as easy as comparing, say, the last two recent MCU movies. Joker and The Batman are highly individual in what they are trying to put forth, and in the kind of story they strive to tell. But for one, there are also some very strong similarities that will make this comparison very interesting. And two, my final conduct will not be entirely objective, meaning that just because I'm saying that one movie is better than the other, this will strongly depend on my own criteria and how I evaluate all the aspects that are good or bad about these films. So now let's get into the structure that I will base this comparison on. I will be comparing these movies in terms of story, looking at things such as continuity, consistency, cohesiveness, but also in terms of complexity and the ambitiousness of the script and the story. Characters, which primarily means the protagonist and the arc he goes through, as well as relevant side characters and their respective relationships. These two aspects are pretty codependent on one another, so they will more or less blend into each other, meaning that I'll be talking about the characters while covering a certain moment or scene in the film, and vice versa. And then we have the quite large category of execution and artistry, if you will, which are all the elements of the film that communicate and present the story to the audience. This includes stuff like cinematography, acting, soundtrack, editing, all the executive and stylistic decisions, basically. And since both of these films take place in the same city, though in different time periods of course, I will also examine the way each of them presents and characterizes Gotham City, the atmosphere, the citizens, the crime, etc. I'd also like to dabble a tad bit into the discussion of comic accuracy, or rather character accuracy, and although I do not value faithfulness to the source material that much, when talking about movies based on comic books, it's pretty tough to not cover it, at least to some extent. So, we'll start by taking a look at the story/plot of Joker. Arthur Fleck, a middle-aged man working as an advertisement and amusement clown, suffers under a plethora of mental illnesses. Aside from colleagues at his job and his mother Penny Fleck, who he lives with and takes care of, Arthur doesn't have any friends, and because of his behavioral issues, he fails to have normal human interactions with the people around him. Although he experiences either indifference or disgust and cruelty from most people around him, and is regarded as an outcast, a freak, all that he desperately desires is for people to accept him. He's an aspiring stand-up comedian who admires and idolizes Murray Franklin, the most successful and famous late-night talk show host in Gotham City. After having his medication cut off and being brutally beaten, Arthur's life takes a very sinister route of murder, emotional pain, and mental chaos. When one of his colleagues at work lends him a gun in order to protect himself from all the violent thugs on the streets, Arthur gets fired from his job for taking the gun to one of his performances for a children's hospital. On his way back home, 3 upper-class drunk guys enter his train and start beating him up. He shoots and kills 2 of them in self-defense, and murders the third as he attempts to flee, which ends up making him an icon as the clown who murdered 3 spoiled rich guys working for Wayne Investments. And this slowly starts an uprising from the mistreated and ignored citizens of Gotham against the people in power, looking down upon and not caring about anyone else. Meanwhile, Arthur tries his hand at performing at his favorite bar and in his mind, it all seems to go pretty well. His jokes land, the city starts to accept him, and even celebrates him, and he has a very supportive girlfriend. However, when his mother admits to him that his father is Mayor Thomas Wayne, things get pretty bad. He visits Wayne Manor and has a short interaction with Bruce, and a scuffle with Alfred. He then visits his mother, who has been hospitalized due to suffering a stroke. And in her hospital room, he sees himself on the Mary Franklin show, being made fun of because of his completely failed stand-up comedy, shattering the illusion of being admired and celebrated during his performance, and also making him feel betrayed by his biggest idol. Afterwards, Arthur seeks out and confronts Thomas Wayne about being his lost son, and Thomas angrily tells him that his mother is insane and that he is not his biological son. This makes Arthur go crazy, and Thomas punches him in the face before leaving. In denial, Arthur visits Arkham State Hospital and steals his mother's file, which states she was a narcissist who adopted Arthur while working as a housekeeper for the Waynes in the 1950s. Penny then raised Arthur with an abusive boyfriend, who later died in jail. For allowing the abuse, Penny was sent to Arkham. Very distraught by what he knows, he enters his girlfriend's apartment unannounced, and when she runs into him, she is terrified. She tells him that she doesn't know him and that he needs to leave, which means that, just like a successful comedy stand-up, he only imagined all the interactions with her. The next day, Arthur strangles his mother in the hospital for lying to him and being a terrible mother for all those years. And as he is preparing his performance, two of his former colleagues visit him because of the passing of his mother. He brutally kills the one, which gave him the gun earlier, but spares the other one, because according to Arthur, he was one of the few people who were actually friendly and nice to him. He then finishes his costume and makes his way to the Murray Franklin show. But as he walks through the street, two cops start chasing him down, as all three of them get into a train filled with protesters and people wearing clown's masks, inspired by Arthur killing the three Wall Street guys. The Protestants start assaulting the cops, and Arthur gets away unscathed. He arrives at the Murray Franklin show, and when he finally gets on stage, he starts talking about how much this society has wronged him, and that he was the guy who killed those Wall Street guys in the subway. And when Murray questions his morality and pushes back against Arthur's statements, he shoots him in the head, and everyone else panics and frantically leaves the set. Arthur, being fully content and consumed by his new persona, gets arrested by the police. And as they drive through the streets, filled with angry rioters and chaos, a stolen ambulance, driven by one of these rioters, crashes into the police car. Everyone on the street starts approaching the car, they help Arthur out of it, and he steps on top of the car, smiling and dancing, as all the protesters and rioters cheer and celebrate him. The film ends with a scene of Arthur in a mental institution, talking to a psychiatrist, and after most likely killing her, he runs away from the guards, and the film ends. Lots to unpack here. Right from the get-go, it is pretty apparent that this is a very personal story, focused on one individual that slowly transforms into the embodiment of that what society hated him for. It is a relatively simple story, and this does it a gigantic favor, cause the story of Joker is actually very competently written. There is almost nothing major about any of the plot beats that's inconsistent or contrived. Looking at all the things that happen to Arthur over the course of the film, all the events follow quite well. It makes perfect sense that an unstable person like him would end up in such a way after having experienced all that turmoil and emotional and physical suffering. For some reason, many film critics really seem to have an issue with everyone being mean and unfriendly towards Arthur. One of the biggest points of criticism for this film is that apparently everyone is way too much of an asshole towards Arthur, and that it somehow feels a bit cartoonish how mean everyone is. And another criticism I've heard many times is that it's highly unrealistic that all of these bad things happen to Arthur throughout the film. But these people fail to realize that many of these negative events are actually connected and result into one another. So let's look at every negative experience Arthur faces in this film, which eventually leads him to the path of Joker. Arthur is beaten up by a couple of kids who steal his advertisement shields. No problem here. Gotham is a shithole, and most people are very much unfriendly and brutal towards strangers, especially a group of young dumb teenagers. On the bus, Arthur is trying to make a young girl laugh, and her mother angrily tells him to stop. Nothing out of the ordinary. I've had people get mad at me on the bus for much less than what Arthur did here. Besides, Just because this woman was unfriendly to him, that doesn't mean that she's a terrible human being. Maybe she just had a bad day or something. Plus, after reading his card, which explains his mental condition, she even looks somewhat remorseful for being so harsh to him. But again, this is Gotham City. As a mother, you'll be extremely careful to protect your child from any threat. The high criminality rate of the environment obviously takes a strong toll on its citizens and hardens them against all the negativity that the city is reeking of. Moving on, we have Arthur's therapist / social worker. She's a bit indifferent to him, and she doesn't seem to take much interest in their conversations. As the film establishes, the people in power do not care about anyone, including both people like Arthur and people like herself. She even mentions that the city funds for the social service program are taken away, which means that she won't get paid and he won't get his medication or any treatment.
They've cut our funding. We're closing down our offices next week. The city's cut funding across the board. Social services is part of that. This is the last time we'll be meeting.
The rich really do not care about the little people, so why would it be strange for her to act a bit apathetic and uninterested in all of their conversations? She doesn't feel appreciated for the work that she provides, and it's tough for pretty much everyone out here.
They don't give a shit about people like you, Arthur. And they really don't give a shit about people like me either.
Then Arthur is given a gun by one of his colleagues, so that he can protect himself if any other ill-minded people might attack him again. And his boss doesn't believe him that he got beat up and got the shield stolen from him. He thinks it's ridiculous that someone would steal an advertisement shield, and so he tells him to give it back or he will reduce his wage for the month. Although I think it's a bit strange that he doesn't believe Arthur at all, you need to take into account that Arthur is very mentally ill, and therefore his boss most likely is always a bit worried about him, and he might not trust him that well. So it does make sense that he is kind of on the fence on whether he believes him, with the story of the bully teenagers stealing his shield. Following that, we see him having the only interaction with the woman who he imagines being his girlfriend. It's a very brief and short interaction, but even just that small sense of friendliness makes Arthur construct a whole relationship with her, which shows how truly isolated and alien he feels around everyone else. We even see him following and stalking her as she's bringing her daughter to school and going about her day, again reinforcing just how socially incapable and mentally ill he is. Then he accidentally drops his gun while performing for the sick children, and then later gets fired by his boss. Again, this makes perfect sense. From the perspective of the boss, Arthur has caused 2 complaints in a matter of days. Plus, he is obviously mentally ill, so the risk of keeping him in the business is way too high. Next, we have the first moment that truly makes Arthur step onto the path of Joker. When 3 young and drunk businessmen working for Wayne Investment start beating him up and he shoots them. This is the only element where I'm a bit lost as to why they were so aggressive and hostile towards Arthur. This could very well be explained by them being drunk and also just being jerks in their day-to-day lives. Because, yeah, people are assholes. Still, all this is highly believable, especially in Gotham City. Also, here is a small possible error, because Arthur shoots 8 bullets out of the revolver, which only can hold a maximum of 5 rounds. This is most likely a mistake by the movie, because it's pretty unlikely that Arthur had all the other bullets with him at this moment, stored in his pocket. So it's pretty safe to say that Arthur didn't reload the gun between the first 2 kills and the last one. However, one could also argue that there is a sense of surrealism to this scene, especially since all of it is shown through Arthur's POV. The train lights start flickering as soon as the guys start beating him up. We also see an unusual amount of blood when he shoots the first 2 guys, and this could be a justification for the unrealistic amount of bullets. Personally, I still think it's just a mistake by the movie, but there are some aspects to the scene that could point to the fact that it is a partial hallucination by Arthur. So after he does his stand-up performance, which he personally is very happy with, he finds the letter of his mother addressed to Thomas Wayne, talking about how he is their son and how they need money and stuff. And so Arthur then takes the train to Wayne Manor and meets Bruce. I find it a bit strange how neutral and open Bruce behaves towards Arthur, who's basically just an extreme weirdo performing some magic tricks to like an 8-year-old. And why would Bruce let Arthur get inside his mouth with his fingers? I would have never reacted that way if I were in Bruce's shoes. Then Alfred shows up and rightfully confronts Arthur for his creepy behavior, and Arthur lashes out at him before running away. And then his mother has a stroke. He gets to the hospital and then sees a recording of his stand-up performance being made fun of on the Murray Franklin show. When I first saw that, I was pretty skeptical, because it seemed like a 70s version of people today ending up on cringe compilation videos. But thinking about it a bit more, this isn't all that unlikely to have happened. Either some random guy at the bar just pulled out a film recording camera and filmed the stand-up, or this comedy club deliberately records all of the performances for whatever purpose. And then someone thought that such a strange and terrible performance would be television worthy, so they sent it to the Murray Franklin show to see what would come of it. It's really not that far-fetched. In fact, as I'm editing this scene, I just noticed that in the scene in which Arthur is giving his performance at the comedy club, we actually see a television screen showing a live recording of the guy that's currently doing a stand-up. So yeah, it's pretty safe to say that the club itself records all its performances and then just sells them to TV shows like they did with Arthur's, or maybe sells them to the individual people that did the stand-up and maybe want to improve their material, see which one of their jokes landed and which ones were bad, and so on. So yeah, there's actually a concrete answer given within the film itself. And Murray even mentions the name of the comedy club from which this clip is.
And finally, in a world where everyone thinks they could do my job, we got this videotape from Pogo's Comedy Club right here in Gotham.
Following that, while a large protest is taking place, Arthur manages to sneak into the very high-class Gotham City movie theater. And just a quick side note, there's one police officer who pushes back one of the protesters, and then he jumps across the barricades and gets tackled by all of the other ones. Dude, what are you doing? That was such a stupid move. Why would you even think of doing something like that? You're obviously going to get tackled. So yeah, Arthur then dresses as a guy working at the theater to get a moment to talk to Thomas Wayne when he goes to the bathroom. Him getting into the theater is very believable, given that all of the police are very busy dealing with the furious protesters. But there's one thing I find a bit problematic. About 40 seconds after Arthur enters the theater wearing his uniform, he notices Thomas Wayne leaving to go to the bathroom, and then Arthur confronts him about being his son. It's very convenient that Thomas decided to go to the toilet at that exact moment, only seconds after Arthur entered the theater. I think it would have been much better if they showed Arthur searching an unoccupied and relatively inconspicuous spot from where he then observes Thomas Wayne while the movie is playing. Maybe even have a skip of 20 to 30 minutes of Arthur just waiting before Thomas decides to go to the bathroom. It's a small change, but it would improve the scene quite a bit. Actually, this scene in the theater could have been utilized incredibly well. Imagine that Arthur, while waiting for Thomas Wayne to stand up, he watches the film and then, as he is watching it, starts hallucinating / imagining himself within the film. Imagine him taking the role of Charlie Chaplin and maybe even killing some people who make fun of him in the movie. And this sequence is all presented in that old black and white silent film aesthetic, so even the kills wouldn't look very brutal or real. I think this would have been an awesome scene to have in this film. It would have been kind of like a insight into Arthur's psyche. It would have been a very artistic and interesting way of displaying that. They could have done a lot with this movie theater setup. But yeah, just some thoughts of mine. But that's not even the biggest issue. What if Thomas Wayne didn't go to the bathroom at all? In that case, Thomas would have never told him about his crazy mother, Arthur wouldn't have stolen his mother's file, and therefore would have never learned the quote-unquote truth about her. He probably would have never killed her in the hospital, and therefore wouldn't have killed his ex-coworker who visited him because of her passing. These are very important decisions for Arthur to make, to then at the end embrace his dark side, shoot Murray in the head, and completely succumb to his new Joker identity. So it's quite reasonable to assume that if Thomas Wayne just didn't go to the bathroom right here, that Arthur would have never fully become the Joker, and the rest of the film just wouldn't happen that way. One could argue that he might have found another way to talk to Thomas Wayne, which yeah, that could be the case. But this would have taken some time, and by then he would have already appeared on the Murray Franklin show, not having killed his mother or his ex-coworker by that point. So this is a pretty substantial element within the story that is very flimsy and easily could have completely changed the final act of this film. This might actually be the biggest issue with Joker's script. However, there's a couple more coming up. So then we get the interaction between Arthur and Thomas, which ends up with Thomas punching him in the face and leaving. And for some reason, many people think that this is a strong overreaction on Thomas's part, but that is just not the case. This weirdo came up to his son and started touching him inappropriately, assaulted his butler, who he has a very close relationship with, and now he even realizes that the same guy is the child of Penny Flake, which was the crazy woman working for him in the 50s. It makes perfect sense for Thomas to punch Arthur right here, and his anger is perfectly justified.
You think this is funny?
Dad, it's me.
Touch my son again? I'll fucking kill you.
And obviously, there's some speculation about the fact that Arthur might actually be Thomas's son, and that he tried to fake Peggy being mentally ill, but I don't think so. Even if that's true, this reaction still makes sense, because Thomas, in that case, most likely feels a lot of regret and hatred towards his past self for having that affair with Peggy, and in that case, his anger in this moment is more directed towards himself. Either way, this is a totally valid reaction. Case closed. And after receiving the call inviting him onto the Murray Franklin show, Arthur goes to Arkham State Hospital and steals Peggy's file. He reads through it and realizes how bad of a mother she was to him and how she lied to him. So, a quick intersection. During the process of editing this, I noticed that this one hospital guard kind of just stands there and is just a few milliseconds away from grabbing Arthur and stopping him from getting away with the file. This is obviously no guarantee that he would have stopped Arthur from reading the file at all. However, if he would have tackled him and stopped him right here, maybe Arthur wouldn't have read the file and wouldn't have figured out his mother's past, and therefore wouldn't have killed her, and etc, etc. So yeah, this could be a minor contrivance, simply because of the fact that the guy was just a few milliseconds too late. Also, Arthur was a bit lucky that the other worker guy didn't close the file and put it to the side, somewhere where Arthur couldn't grab it. This is a very minor thing, but it isn't too unlikely to have happened. If he did that, then Arthur would need to somehow sneak inside the room to even get to the file. But to be fair, it's also just as likely that the guy did what he did in the film. A bit lucky maybe, but nothing substantial. Moving on. So he goes to sit down in the apartment of his imaginative girlfriend, and when she shows up and panics, it's obvious that he only imagined all of the moments with her. And again, for some reason, many people have a very big problem with the film showing their previous scenes, how they actually played out, with just Arthur pretending to have a conversation with her and hanging out with her and stuff. So many people say that it is unnecessary and that it takes away from the impact of this moment. I have a slight issue with it. I vividly remember being a bit annoyed in the theater because of that very short montage of clips, so I do understand where the criticism is coming from, but to be fair, it is very short and very insignificant in the grand scheme of the film. This is more of a presentation and filmmaking aspect, and I do think the scene would have done better without it, but it really doesn't matter all that much. If this is such a huge point of criticism for everyone, then the film is doing a pretty good job, I think. And as Arthur leaves the apartment and steps into his own apartment, it might be implied that he killed the woman, but I highly doubt that. Because if he did kill her right here, this surely would have been brought up later in the film. The daughter would have woken up from the noise and called the police, or knocked at the door of other neighbors. It's very unlikely that he killed her, since she didn't hurt him in any way, unlike everyone else he kills in this film. In the film, Arthur only kills people that are very hostile towards him, or that he feels betrayed or hurt by. But she doesn't check any of those boxes, so yeah, moving on. The next day, Arthur goes to Peggy in the hospital, and furious with her, he strangles her with her own pillow, and then goes back home. And as he prepares his makeup and his costume for the performance, he is visited by two ex-coworkers, and he violently kills the one guy who got him fired, but he spares the other one, since he was always nice to him. Next, we see Arthur in his full costume, happily dancing his way down the stairs. And then we see the two cops that questioned him previously, and they get into a chase that leads all three of them onto a train. And as the cops walk through the busy train, Arthur takes a clown mask from a random guy, which then causes a scuffle in the train. The one cop/detective takes out his gun to make all the passengers get to the side, but he is attacked by one protester, who he then accidentally shoots and kills. And so the other passengers start tackling both cops and start beating them up, which makes Arthur get away. The one problem with this scene is that the cop creates an extremely dangerous and tense situation when pulling out his gun. Arthur is pretty far away from them, and a seasoned, experienced police officer would know that doing something like this is very risky for everyone. Couple that with the already pretty tense situation caused by the scuffle, and the fact that this train is primarily filled with people who probably aren't very fond of the police, it does seem a bit strange that he just pulls out his gun like that. Still, this could be justified by the cop's current mental state. He's obviously very stressed out and behaves pretty aggressively towards the protesters. So it isn't too far-fetched that he would pull out his gun in such a tense situation, surrounded by people that probably don't like him very much, and he maybe also doesn't like. But it's still a bit of an overreaction, even given all the circumstances. He then gets to the Murray Franklin show, he talks to Murray in the dressing/preparation room, and then he practices his suicide one last time before going on stage. And as he's talking to Murray and the audience, the conversation gets more and more heated. And then Arthur decides not to kill himself, but to fight against the evil guys on top instead. So out of hate, frustration and anger, he shoots Murray and gets arrested by the police. The one point of criticism most people mention here is that they didn't check Arthur for any weapons before letting him onto the show. But remember, this takes place in the 70s, 80s? Stuff wasn't nearly as secure as it has been for the last 20 years. So I do not think it is too strange that they wouldn't have harsh security put in place for a talk show. One could argue that Gotham is incredibly dangerous and filled with crime, so there would be a much stronger incentive to employ security to many locations. But also remember that the people in power do not care about the well-being of Gotham's citizens. They've cut the funds for the social services program, so why would they keep a strong eye on security? Of course, Murray Franklin is not part of the normal class citizens, so it is much more likely that he would have some form of security put in place. Still, we have to account for the time period in which Joker takes place, and given that aspect, I don't think it's contrived that he wasn't checked for weapons. And at that point in time, the riots on the streets are already escalating to a huge degree, which is also inspired by Arthur's television appearance a few moments ago. And then, the ambulance crashes into the police car. Arthur is freed from the rioters and dances on top of the car. There's another slight issue with this final part. How did they manage to identify and follow the police car in which Arthur was sitting in? Looking at how chaotic the situation in the city is at that point, I'm pretty damn sure that tons of police cars are currently driving through the city. We even see a few of them in some other shots. So how could they surely tell that the one guy from TV is in that specific police car? This certainly would have been hard to time perfectly. There must have been like a larger group of people that communicated with one another. So some guys must have observed Arthur getting thrown in the police car, and the others must have coordinated themselves so that they perfectly hit the car with the ambulance. I do not think that this is what happened. This is just... I don't think this is realistic. Even though this is a bit contrived, potentially, it doesn't really change anything substantial about the story, because it just gives us this very great shot of Arthur standing and dancing on top of the police car, being celebrated by everyone, and fully embracing the Joker identity. But afterwards, we see Arthur arrested in the mental facility, which means that after that scene, he got arrested either way. So this aspect doesn't change a vastly substantial part of the story, so it's not that relevant. However, I do think that this last moment of Arthur being admired and celebrated by everyone around him, just like he always wanted, is a very impactful and important character moment. So yeah, I think this criticism is still relevant. And then we have the final scene of Joker sitting in the mental facility with a psychiatrist. We also see the Waynes getting shot by one of the rioters that was inspired by Joker, saying the exact words that he spoke before shooting Murray. And then Arthur walks down a corridor of the facility, with his shoes being all bloody, implying that he might have killed the psychiatrist. I don't think this is what happened, because throughout the entire film, Arthur was only killing people that he felt very wronged by. And I'm not sure that this random psychiatrist would fit into that category. I don't know what this final shot means, honestly. I don't know why his shoes are bloody, it's kind of strange. So, looking at all the major events that happened to Arthur, I think it's safe to say that the continuity is pretty strong. All the events clearly follow one another, and many happen as a result of a previous event that happened to him. And keep in mind, the entire point of the story is to show how an already unstable guy, who has all of these events happen to him, at the right place, at the right time, can turn into the Joker. The central idea or message of this film is that everyone could potentially become the Joker, if they're pushed far enough by their environment. That is precisely why this movie is called Joker and not The Joker. There is this theory that almost everything that happened in this film is just an imagination or a dream of Arthur that he's thinking of while he's in the mental institution, and that especially the final third of the movie didn't happen in that way. And the film does drop a few ambiguous hints that this could be the case, like some stuff with the time of the clocks and the one old photo of Peggy that Arthur looks at, and when he turns it around, it reads a flirtatious and romantic message from Thomas Wayne addressed to Peggy. The movie intentionally leaves some of these aspects up for interpretation, but I am very confident when I say that I think all of the events, except for the imagined girlfriend and the very first scene where he envisions himself being on the Murray Franklin show, actually happened that way. And the central reason for this is the scene of the Waynes getting shot by that one rioter. The guy shoots Thomas Wayne, which could be imagined by Arthur, but then he also kills Martha Wayne, which Arthur has no connection to whatsoever. He never interacted with her. He most likely doesn't even know how she looks like. So why would he imagine or dream about her death? Again, Arthur only wishes death upon people that he really dislikes. So there is no reason that this scene would be imagined by him. The only feasible argument I can think of is that Arthur was an orphan when he was younger, and then Peggy adopted him. So I can entertain the idea of Arthur wishing that Bruce will suffer the same experience that he had when he was a child, but this is a bit far-fetched, I think. There is much more pointing to the fact that all of this actually happened. Yeah, Joker's script is pretty tight, honestly. There are very few issues or flimsy plot points that drag the story down. Pretty good stuff. Alright, moving on to the plot/story of The Batman. On Halloween, Gotham City Mayor Don Mitchell Jr. is murdered by a man calling himself the Riddler. Reclusive billionaire Bruce Wayne, who has operated for 2 years as the vigilante Batman, investigates alongside the Gotham City Police Department. Lieutenant James Gordon discovers a message that the Riddler left for Batman. The Riddler kills Commissioner Pete Savage and leaves another message for Batman. Batman and Gordon discover that the Riddler left a thumb drive in Mitchell's car, containing images of Mitchell with a woman, Annika, at the Iceberg Lounge, a nightclub operated by the Penguin. While the Penguin pleads ignorance, Batman notices that Selina Kyle, Annika's roommate and friend, works at the club as a waitress. When Annika disappears, Batman sends Selina back to the Iceberg Lounge for answers, and discovers that Savage was on Falcone's payroll, as is District Attorney Gil Colson. The Riddler abducts Colson, straps a timed collar bomb to his neck, and sends him to interrupt Mitchell's funeral. When Batman arrives, the Riddler calls him via Colson's phone and threatens to detonate the bomb if Colson cannot answer 3 riddles. Colson refuses to answer the third, the name of the informant who gave the GCPD information that led to a historic drug bust ending mobster Salvatore Maroni's operation, and dies. Batman and Gordon deduce that the informant may be the Penguin and track him to a drug deal. They discover that Maroni's operation transferred to Falcone, with many corrupt GCPD officers involved. Selina inadvertently exposes them when she arrives to steal some money and discovers Annika's corpse in a car trunk. After a car chase, Batman captures the Penguin but learns he is not the informant. Batman and Gordon follow the Riddler's trail to the ruins of an orphanage funded by Bruce's dead parents, where they learn that the Riddler holds a grudge against the Wayne family. Bruce's butler and caretaker, Alfred Pennyworth, is hospitalized after opening a letter bomb addressed to Bruce. The Riddler leaks evidence that Thomas, who was running for mayor before he was murdered, hired Falcone to kill a journalist for threatening to reveal details about Martha and her family's history of mental illnesses. Bruce, who grew up believing his father was morally upstanding, confronts Alfred. Alfred maintains that Thomas only asked Falcone to threaten the journalist into silence. Thomas planned to turn himself and Falcone over to the police once he found out that Falcone killed the journalist instead. Alfred believes that Falcone had Thomas and Martha killed to prevent this. Selina reveals to Batman that Falcone is her neglectful father. She plans to kill him after learning that he strangled Annika because Mitchell told her that Falcone was the informant. Batman and Gordon arrive in time to stop her, but the Riddler kills Falcone as he is being arrested. The Riddler is unmasked as forensic accountant Edward Nashton and is incarcerated in Arkham State Hospital, where he tells Batman he took inspiration from him when targeting the corrupt. Batman learns that the Riddler has stationed car bombs around Gotham and cultivated an online following that plans to assassinate Mayor-elect Bea-Real. The bombs destroy the seawall around Gotham and flood the city. The Riddler's followers attempt to kill Real, but are stopped by Batman and Selina. In the aftermath, the Riddler befriends another inmate, while Selina deems Gotham beyond saving and leaves. Batman aids recovery efforts and vows to inspire hope in Gotham. So what I just read was the plot synopsis of the film as it is written on Wikipedia. And by that, it's pretty clear that the story of the Batman is very complex and deals with many different variables and players within it. So it is no surprise when I tell you that this plot doesn't function that well. Let's go through the biggest issues right now in chronological order. The first criticism / flaw is part of a larger world-building issue of the film, which is the relationship between Batman and the police. It is very strange that all the cops at the crime scene where the mayor was killed do not push back way more against Batman being here. It's made very apparent that the police is not at all fond of Batman, since he's a vigilante.
He's involved in this?
No, he's not involved.
How do you know? He's a goddamn vigilante. He could be a suspect.
I find it very hard to believe that none of them would try to arrest him, since the only protection he has in this moment is Lieutenant Gordon's trust. But everyone else is incredibly skeptic of him, and it's also important to keep in mind that many of them are corrupt, so there would be an even stronger incentive to arrest him. And when the commissioner arrives at the scene and is surprised to see Batman here, he criticizes Gordon for involving him in this investigation. But there should be much more of a pushback from pretty much everyone. And no, I do not think that Gordon has enough authority as a lieutenant to make all of them be tolerant of Batman investigating the crime scene. There will be many more scenes with the police that are similarly contrived and ignore relatively obvious factors that break them almost entirely. We'll get to them when we get to them. The next point is very minor, but Gordon should have been a bit more careful when taking the encrypted USB from the Riddler and just putting it into his private laptop. He shouldn't be surprised that all the photos were automatically sent to all the news broadcasts from his email. Either way, the Riddler had access to the photos and would have sent them out himself if Gordon put that drive into a secure laptop. So this doesn't change anything in terms of the plot, but I think Gordon should have been more careful here. In the next scene, Batman goes to the iceberg launch to ask the Penguin on the identity of the woman in the photos. He knocks on the door and this thug opens it, closes it, and then gets his twin to intimidate Batman together, telling him he should leave. And of fucking course, he beats them up in 3 seconds and steps into the club. These two guys are complete idiots. Batman has been active for 2 years now, and it's been established that basically everyone knows how strong and dangerous he can be. These guys work for the Penguin, so they undoubtedly should know that fighting Batman is not a good idea. Pretty stupid. So Batman gets inside the club and is attacked by a lot of goons. Now, this fight scene is pretty great on a technical level, however, it is incredibly irresponsible for the last two guys to pull out guns and start shooting at Batman, given that this is a very crowded, dark club with flashing lights. They could have easily injured or killed innocent people during this fight. And I'm pretty sure the Penguin would try his best to avoid that kind of stuff happening in his club. And what makes this even stranger is the fact that the Penguin just walks up to him as he's still fighting his goons. So why even escalate the situation to that degree when the Penguin wants to handle things quietly and easily? One could argue that these guys didn't know the Penguin's orders in the hassle of how fast Batman showed up here, and that's why they attacked him. But just like with the twin thugs before, they know how strong Batman is, so why even try? And there's also the huge risk of killing innocent people. So what the hell are you guys doing? Another issue I have with this concerns Batman's strategy right here. Man, he just walks through the main door. This is not the optimal way of getting to the Penguin with the least amount of trouble or potential conflict. I'd argue it does some considerable damage to his character, since he most likely expected something like this to happen. Maybe without the guns, but it's still pretty headstrong behavior. Batman is usually much more careful and stealthy in situations like this. The best argument for his bad decision making right here is that this is a very young Batman that might become much more clever and capable later in his career. But I don't think this is good enough. There are many points in this film that show how silent and sneaky he can be when he wants to.
We're pretty good at that.
Hey, I can't get through. The lines are down.
You're leaving.
Jesus. Don't you ever just say hello?
So this is just a very dumb decision on his part. I actually have a few problems with the portrayal of Batman in this film, which we'll get to later. So, now we get to what is most likely the biggest plot contrivance in the entire film. As Batman talks to the Penguin, Selina walks in and they exchange a few looks. She brings Penguin some money and he gives her those drug droplets. And as she takes them, Selina reacts quite overtly when seeing the photos of Annika. And Bruce catches up on this, as well as the pair of shoes she's wearing, which match the pair of shoes on the photo. And this gives him a huge clue on Annika, since he then follows Selina to her apartment. This one very brief interaction with Selina gives Bruce so much crucial information for his investigation. If Selina didn't come in while he was talking to Penguin, which is about 5 to 10 minutes in total, Bruce would have had no clue on the identity of Annika. So the one time he decides to enter the Iceberg Lounge, he just happens to come across the girlfriend of Annika, who is coincidentally also wearing the exact same shoes as on the photo. I think the problem of all this is quite obvious. You could write off the shoe thing by assuming that Selina always wears a specific outfit when she's working in the club, but it's still an absurdly convenient coincidence. And remember, Selina was surprised to see Batman here. She was entering the Penguin's office for a totally unrelated reason. The way the scene plays out helped Batman so much in figuring out what these photos mean. It's insanely lucky. And this obviously leads to both of them working together to expose Falcone at the end. A whole bunch of the story depends on this short meeting between the two. Not great. Now we get to the scene of Selina breaking into the mayor's house. And as she opens the safe, Batman appears behind her and they have a bit of a fight. And all that noise alerts a police officer who is currently patrolling through the house. I find it pretty convenient that 1. The officer wasn't curious enough to just maybe take a closer look at the room, and 2. That he didn't notice the open safe or Selina's gadgets lying on the floor. This guy could have very easily spotted them right here, and this could have been a big problem, because if he spotted them, they would have had to knock him out, which would cause many inconveniences, especially for Batman further down the line. It's a very lucky moment for sure. And later, we get the scene of Selina going through the Iceberg Lounge, wearing one of Batman's high-tech camera contact lenses. And this way, Batman can get all sorts of information on which people are corrupt and stuff. This helps him a lot in the case, all thanks to that very convenient interaction between the two. And she gets into a conversation with the DA, who is incredibly high on those eye drop drugs. So Selina sits down with him, and she manages to pull a shit ton of private and potentially incriminating information out of him, with almost no effort whatsoever. And she isn't even trying all that hard to hide her interest in these informations. What's more, the DA is very clearly not comfortable talking about that stuff. So why on earth does he tell her all of this? Just because he's high on drugs? Come on, that's way too weak of an explanation. I mean, hell, this guy is the DA. He's a professional. If anyone should be very careful telling some random person about all of the illegal and shady stuff that's going down in the city, it's him. This guy, very conveniently, is so high on drugs that he just tells her all that Bruce needs to know to take drastic progress in figuring out the corruption in Gotham.
There was a rat. We had an informant. We had big-time information on Salvatore Maroni. That's how we got him out of the drops business.
I was talking about the Maroni case.
But if this guy knows, it's gonna come out.
What's even more stupid is that Selina went there the exact time in which the DA was there. We even see him leave shortly after, when he gets abducted by the Riddler in his car. So, if Bruce and Selina decided to go to the club a day or two, heck, even just an hour later, Bruce would have probably never gotten all of that crucial information. All of that stuff would be lost, and he would need to figure it out another way. There is a very clear pattern of the story bending itself so that Batman can proceed with his investigations. And this is a very big issue, especially when it comes to a Batman story, I think. Jumping ahead a tiny bit, we get to the scene in which a car crashes into the crowded church of people, and the DA steps out with a bomb attached to his body, and also a ringing phone for the Batman. And we get a short time skip of maybe about 2 to 3 hours, with the police having surrounded and cleared the entire area. And Gordon has contacted Batman to answer the phone and to take the lead in this situation. Similar to the very first scene with the police, I do not think that the police would let this guy, who all of them except Gordon distrust very much, do anything in this situation. They even react in shock and outrage when realizing that Batman is here and basically takes over their job. The only reason for them to not interfere at all is the fact that the Batman is supposed to answer the phone. However, I don't think this would stop them from trying to handle the situation themselves, or at least with Batman together. They would 100% insist on giving him instructions or some guidelines. But what they do here, which is basically doing nothing and watching Batman do his thing, is not in line with what we are told about the relationship between the police and Batman. This is a pretty severe situation. The DA could potentially die here. So I find it extremely hard to believe that they wouldn't take matters into their own hands and let Batman just have his way with the Riddler and the DA. So when the DA refuses to say the name of the rat on Riddler's livestream, he gets blown up, with Batman standing right in front of him. So Bruce is dead. This is a pretty huge explosion, and he was standing like 3 inches away from the DA. There's no way in hell that he wouldn't sustain any severe injuries because of this. He's thrown back a good 5 meters and then falls unconscious. But this doesn't really affect him at all going forward. It only knocks him out for some time. Besides, how stupid was it on Bruce's part to not be more careful and distance himself? He even could have just thrown his cape around him to guard him at least a little bit. But no, he just doesn't care about this bomb potentially blowing up in his face. And next we see him lying on the table of an interrogation room with many cops surrounding him and curiously looking at him. One guy decides to try and pull off Batman's mask, but very conveniently he wakes up at that exact moment and immediately starts fighting them. Dude, are you not totally disoriented and dizzy right now? You had a bomb explode right in front of you maybe 2 hours ago, and as soon as you wake up you're just back on track ready to go? We can be glad you didn't die right here. What's even dumber about this, apparently the cops, who saw Batman essentially getting blown up in the church, decided to put him into a police car, drive him to the apartment, and drop him onto this table? Still wearing a suit and armor? Guys, this man needs medical attention. Who knows what kind of potentially life-threatening injuries he sustained because of this explosion. Whatever they decided to do here is pretty stupid and unrealistic. They should have called an ambulance right away and have taken off his suit to save this guy's life. Even further, Gordon prevents the other cops from taking off Batman's mask, even though he would absolutely take it off himself, given how much this explosion should have fucked Batman up. I really do not like this scene very much, because these issues are just so in your face. So when Batman runs up onto the rooftop of the building, he wraps his cape around him, which creates some sort of a wingsuit that he then uses to fly off the building. Now, as cool as this entire sequence is presented, how it ends is incredibly atrocious. Batman, for some fucking reason, tries to land on the top of a truck, but when he's almost there, he gets caught between it and a bridge. He smashes his head against a steel bar, he then hits the truck, and then smashes onto the street. Man, you are dead so many times over. The sheer momentum he had when smashing into the bridge would have been enough to kill him. But instead, he just awkwardly hobbles away and we get to the next scene, where he's totally fine again. The plot armor is through the roof at this point. And the thing is, it didn't have to be that way at all. He could have just landed onto the ground somewhere, and all of the shit could have been avoided. Why make Batman both stupid and almost invincible with this scene by having him fly straight into a bridge? Whose idea was this? Next, Batman and Gordon go to some industrial area where there's a drug deal happening with a penguin. And right as they are both observing the deal, Selina shows up to steal some money. She goes to the car and opens the first bag of money, followed by the second bag, revealing the corpse of her girlfriend Annika. Which is weird. At that point in the story, it has been quite some time since she was abducted from her home and killed. So why would they leave her around in this car for that long? They don't have any benefit in keeping her. As soon as they killed her, they should have gotten rid of the body. Besides, why would her body be right next to the bag of money in this exact car? This very stupid and unrealistic decision to keep the body is clumsily forced onto them just so Selina and the audience knows that Arnika has been killed. The scene continues with them getting noticed by everyone and being shot at. And then Batman reveals his Batmobile and starts chasing down the Penguin in a very cool car chase. But Gordon is still there, surrounded by all of these dangerous gunmen. Gordon should very likely die, because Batman just decided to disregard him entirely and go after the Penguin instead. This is a very huge issue, and the film is totally oblivious to the fact that Batman just left Gordon to die, because he thought that getting the Penguin is much more important than saving the life of the only cop who deeply trusts him. This is a substantial issue, and I'm not even primarily talking about Batman's decision. What's really bad about this is the fact that Gordon easily got out of this encounter, seemingly totally unscathed, when he shows up later in the scene where they interrogate the Penguin. Gordon doesn't even mention the fact that Batman left him there on his own. I find it baffling that they've overlooked that part in the script. It's pretty damaging stuff. And this is followed by another very big issue, maybe even multiple ones. So this very awesomely shot car chase ends with the Penguin causing a lot of destruction on the street, with many cars and trucks piling up and crashing against each other. And then a ramp perfectly drops right in front of Batman. He speeds up and drives over the pile of vehicles that are now exploding. What the actual fuck? The chances of this happening are so incalculably small. Batman should have realistically died here, or at least be so severely injured that the Penguin would have gotten away. But instead, this shit happens, and Batman smashes, or rather flies straight into the Penguin's car, making it flip 30 times over and land upside down. This should have caused much more damage to Penguin than we see him sustain because of this, which is almost nothing. At least have him knocked out for a few moments or something. But in the interrogation scene, he seems completely fine again, which I guess I can believe, but still, this crash was pretty brutal, and Batman can't be sure that the Penguin will survive what he does to him here, which is also pretty bad for his character. He needs Penguin alive. This is not a great or secure way of achieving that goal, my man. What's even worse about this is the fact that Batman just steps out of his Batmobile and walks up to the Penguin, even though right behind him is a massive fire with a bunch of destroyed vehicles and many dead people. Batman doesn't acknowledge this at all. He only cares to get the Penguin. He even takes his sweet time walking to his car. And why does he do that? Well, because they want to have the extremely cool slow-mo shot of Batman stepping out of his Batmobile in front of a massive fire, walking towards the upside-down camera. And yes, it's a great shot. It's a great fucking shot. But damn, everything else about this scene suffers immensely just for this shot to happen, which is not great. The complete negligence on Batman's part about the safety of the people, even before the explosion happened, as he was chasing down Penguin with very high speeds, damages his character a lot. And neither Batman nor the Penguin face any consequences because of this massive explosion. No one cares to bring it up again. It is simply a thing that happened because it looks cool, and please just don't think about it, guys. Please don't. The next somewhat flawed scene is when Bruce does that weird detective montage in his house, where he sprays the floor with paint and does this super time-consuming arrangement right after visiting Alfred in the hospital for the first time. This scene is pretty hilarious, to be honest. What the hell are you doing, Bruce? He's going out of his way to make it harder for himself to work on the case effectively. Why not just have everything laid out on a desk or a table so that he can actually work on stuff and easily take notes and so on? This is just a super bizarre sequence. I think it only exists to have some cool visuals and shots, but again, in complete expense of the characters. Like, you know you have to clean this shit up afterwards, right? When Bruce walks up to Falcone and asks if his dad had the journalist killed, like the Riddler said on TV, we see the Penguin just chilling around. This means that he didn't get arrested by the police after the car chase with Batman. This is absurd. Gordon should have contacted someone for the explosion that the Riddler caused and the lives he took, but they just leave him there and don't seem to care at all. Next pretty strange thing. When Selina activates the bat signal on that building when she's torturing the corrupt cop from earlier, Batman and Gordon show up, and they both seem very confused about someone else having turned it on. So Selina essentially just went up there, and so could literally anyone else in Gotham City. I find it pretty strange that Bruce and Gordon didn't take care to close off this place at least a little bit, so that only they can access it. Because if you think about it, a random guy could just follow the signal and locate the building where it's coming from. So by that logic, many people should know about this location, and many would have probably tried to access it over the last 2 years. Pretty weird. Another thing in this scene, this corrupt police officer doesn't have any problem with telling Batman and Gordon pretty much everything they need to know about the corrupt system of Gotham City. Compare that to the DA in the church, who, even when the Riddler was about to blow him up, was way too scared to say that Falcone is the rat. And this guy just keeps on talking about much more than just Falcone, which is a bit strange, even given the fact that he has been tortured by Selina. Further, when Selina goes to shoot the guy, Bruce pulls her back, and then she slowly walks towards him and puts his leg onto him before pushing him off the building. I think Bruce should have reacted much faster. He should have pulled her back again as soon as she was giving off signs that she was going to push the police officer off. But instead, Gordon and Bruce just wait for her to push him off before they start doing anything. Like, why? It looks so stupid. When Selina is alone with Falcone, why does she take so long to kill him? As soon as she is alone with him, she should be pulling out her gun and shoot him. This is a relatively big problem, considering that she has a huge time advantage on Bruce, who still needs to unmask himself, get inside the club, and then fight all these guards with the machine guns. It's incredibly lucky that right as Batman is about to turn off the power of Falcone's room, Selina goes for the kill at that exact moment, and never before that. The timing of this is pretty insane. And we also have another very big inconsistency concerning Batman's suit durability. Earlier in the film, we see him being shot at, and it makes him stumble back a bit, which means that he can tank some shots from regular handguns, but it will have an impact on him. However, in this sequence, where the guys have much stronger and high caliber machine guns, Batman easily goes up to them and punches them as they keep shooting at him. This is bad, since compared to the previous instances of him getting shot, he's pretty much invincible in this short fight scene. It looks great. It looks really great. But the further implications are quite concerning and mess with his vulnerability a lot. And when Selina is about to shoot Falcone, I don't think she should have missed that shot. Yeah, the lights turned off, but she did pull the trigger before that point, so I don't know. It seems like a relatively tough shot to miss. So then, Batman takes Falcone outside to all the non-corrupt cops to arrest him. And then Penguin, who some fucking how is still not in jail, pops up at the front door and pulls an Uzi right in front of all the cops. What a stupid move. What was he expecting the police was gonna do to him afterwards? Well, they should arrest him straight away and put him in jail, right? No. He is not arrested after almost killing Gordon and many other police officers, which is just incredibly weird. It's the dumbest thing. Besides, how the heck is Batman still working with the police after punching Gordon in the face and fleeing from them? They should arrest him as well. The film just doesn't acknowledge all the bad and incriminating things that the Penguin and the Batman have done throughout. It's pretty frustrating. And so the police arrest the Riddler and go up to his apartment, and a forensics team inspects the entire place. But they fail to look under the carpet? Come on, this is kinda ridiculous. They should have definitely found the map of Gotham under the carpet. This is a very contrived oversight. And the way Batman manages to figure it out is so dumb as well. He cluelessly walks through the Riddler's apartment after their conversation, and then this random ass cop we saw 2 times earlier shows up and says, "Oh, my dad was a carpenter. This is a tool to remove carpets." And yeah, that's that. This moment is so poorly done. If it wasn't for this random cop, Batman would have been completely lost. He wouldn't have figured it out in time to stop the Riddler's followers from shooting everyone or something, whatever they were planning to do. For a detective story, there is a ton of very convenient stuff happening to our protagonist. It's not that great. Now, let's talk about the Riddler's plan a bit, cause unfortunately, there's another big issue. When he talks to Batman through his cell, he thinks that Batman has already figured out his plan to the end, also including the final hidden map underneath the carpet, and the video of himself explaining that he plans on flooding the city.
It was all there. You mean you didn't figure it out? Oh, you're really not as smart as I thought you were. I guess I gave you too much credit. What have you done?
But if this were the case, If Batman figured out that last bit together with the police before he went to talk to the Riddler, they would have had enough time to prevent the vans from exploding, which means that his plan would fail. If they saw the map and the marked locations on it, plus the video, they could have easily went to these locations and defuse all the bombs in time. Even if they didn't see the video on Riddler's computer explaining his plan, the map is enough info for them to check these locations and see what's going on. So why is the Riddler surprised when he realizes that Batman hasn't figured it out yet? Because if he did, the Riddler's plan just wouldn't work. What's up with that? It doesn't make any sense. So then the city starts getting flooded, and a lot of people are running towards Square Garden, where the new mayor is going to give her speech. But hold on, why would they tell all the civilians to come to this place specifically? This doesn't seem to be the safest place in the city. They should have just told everyone to enter a high building and get as high as possible. Telling everyone to go here is really not the most optimal decision. And Riddler's followers are chilling on the construction near the roof of Square Garden, preparing to, I guess, shoot everybody? And of course, there's a lot of panic and chaos, so the police are assuring the mayor not to go onto the stage, but she does it anyway, which I think is pretty unrealistic. The police should absolutely stop her. Especially Gordon wouldn't leave her on her own to go out there. They would definitely hold her back. And then she gets shot by one of the Riddler guys. Gordon runs outside to drag her off the stage, and as he does so, the other guys start shooting at her multiple times. I'm not sure how capable these guys are with guns, but I'm pretty sure at least half of them know their stuff, so I find it very strange that all of their shots miss her. There's definitely some plot armor right here. So then Batman comes in to save everyone and stop the shooters. But the way he goes about entering Square Garden is highly irresponsible and negligent. He makes the glass roof of the area shatter with explosives, and all the many shards fall down into the area. It's very lucky that no one died or got injured by all of these shards. We don't even know if no one got hurt. So yeah, Batman potentially hurt some civilians just to look cool when entering the building. Why not make it more stealthy? Have him suddenly appear behind the shooters or something. That would be much more in line with Batman's methods in general as well. But oh well, I guess we gotta have all of these cool shots and moments without thinking about their implications. Also, Batman again has a ton of plot armor in this fight. Especially when he's holding onto that round thing in the middle. The guys just keep shooting and shooting at him. And not only do they miss so many times, but Batman doesn't even seem very concerned about this current situation, which is very unsatisfying. It really messes with the stakes of this fight. Plus, when the last guy blasts Batman with a shotgun, he very slowly approaches him and takes his sweet time reloading and aiming at him so that Selina has enough time to save Batman. Again, pretty heavy plot armor. And now we get to the final plot armor moment of the film, which is Batman surviving the electric shock of the huge wire that he cuts off with his batarang. This wire has enough electric energy to kill many people in the water. And this is exactly why Bruce immediately decides to endanger and potentially sacrifice himself for these people. I actually thought that they were going to kill Batman in this moment, because I couldn't think of any way that he would be able to survive so many volts shooting through his body. But then again, given how incredibly durable his suit is, this might actually be a thing that he could survive. But he's been doing this vengeance thing for only 2 years. Does it really make sense that his suit is so ridiculously overpowered so early in his career? I don't think so. Well, that was something. There's no denying that the Batman has a ton of plot issues. And what's pretty frustrating about this is that these are substantial problems that could have been fixed pretty easily. They just needed some few tweaks to set all of these small pieces into a much more cohesive and coherent full picture. The plot is this film's biggest problem, from the relationship between Batman and the Gotham police, the very apparent plot armor in many scenes, how the story doesn't acknowledge extremely substantial and important implications of many scenes just because they want a cool shot. There are all the conveniences that give Batman crucial clues and information to solve the case, and just a bunch of very oddly timed moments that are super unlikely to happen. However, despite all of these plot issues, which there are quite a lot of, there still are many excellent and very deliberate decisions in terms of how it was written. I think that this story, even with all its flaws, has a lot of great stuff going for it. Especially looking at its major themes and the arc of Batman and Bruce finding himself, as well as a lot of character relationships that are very emotionally resonant. I'll be covering that stuff mostly in the character section. So, it's pretty clear that Joker's script is much tighter than the Batman's. It's not even close, to be honest. But a very important aspect to consider is that the Batman is dealing with much more variables to juggle and keep track of. There are a lot of relevant players within the story, as well as a ton of elements to keep track of and to keep cohesive, which obviously is somewhat tough to do. Joker, on the other hand, is a much simpler and focused story. It's about one guy who slowly grows to embrace the chaos inside himself, while the miserable world around him goes on a similar path and stands up against all the ignorant people in power. It easily would be better than Joker if Joker had a similar magnitude of plot issues, but it doesn't. Joker's plot and story is very well constructed. There is so little that can be considered an actual problem within the story's structure. It's just very good. So, Joker has a much better story and plot than the Batman. Yes, the Batman is a much more complicated story to nail because of its complexity, but this is the caveat when you want to tell such a story. And to be clear, if both of these stories had zero plot issues, then the Batman would easily run superior over Joker. But it unfortunately has too many issues to call it a very good plot. Now we move on to the characters of both films. Starting again with Joker. Let's see. Arthur, being the most explored and most fleshed out character in the film, obviously is the most compelling character we've got. He has this deeply rooted desire to be loved and respected by others because of his abusive childhood and his complete and utter isolation from other people. And the few people he does have contact with still do not offer him any closer human connections. His mother obviously loves him, but this relationship is not all that reciprocal. He simply takes care of her because she's an old and weak woman. He doesn't have any friends, and the one person that comes closest to being a friend of his is his idol Murray Franklin, who he doesn't know personally and who even makes fun of him on television. He is at the very bottom of people suffering under the city's system of oppression and greediness, and as he starts going deeper and deeper into his dark side, which hates and fights back against everyone looking down on him, the people of Gotham see within him a symbol of resistance and revolution in a sense. At the end, Arthur fully becomes Joker, since that is exactly what everyone around him encourages him to do. It's a state in which he is actually admired and celebrated. It's pretty interesting how he was hated and despised by everyone around him for the same things that he is celebrated for in the end. Arthur is a pretty good character. Also, I think it's interesting how Arthur, same as Bruce, is an orphan in this story. It's a quite compelling parallel to draw between the two. Next up we've got Murray, and while many might think that every character except Arthur is just a one-dimensional caricature, this is not the case, especially not for Murray. We see him make fun of Arthur by using his clip for a short comedic section on his show, but unlike many people think, he doesn't do this with a malicious intent. First off, he is ready to invite Arthur onto his show, and when he talks to Arthur backstage, he seems very down to earth and nice. There is a clear distinction between his talk show host persona and the private Murray. He gives Arthur some positive talk and briefs him for what the show will be like before going on stage. He's not arrogant or unfriendly at all. And when we see Arthur get crazy on live television, Murray doesn't just write him off as a crazy lunatic and stops the show. He actually tries to argue with him and point out the flaws of Arthur's perspective. And he actually seems to care about entertaining his audience and making them feel good. He didn't deserve to die because of what he did. Arthur, in his mentally unstable state, took those jokes about him on television as a much more malicious and evil act than Murray himself. And sadly, he ended up paying the price for Arthur's chaotic and shattered mental state. Looking at Peggy Fleck, she's extremely mentally ill, and most likely has been for a very long time. Surely for all the time she was raising Arthur with her abusive boyfriend. She doesn't seem to have any interests besides getting financial support from Thomas Wayne by claiming that Arthur is their son, which is very likely untrue given the level of her delusion. She was a terrible mother for Arthur and did him much more harm than good by choosing to adopt him. She just didn't have the mental strength or the responsibility to raise an orphan. Next we have the therapist/social worker. And she also isn't as bland as people make her out to be. Yes, she doesn't give Arthur a lot of attention or care. However, as we are told in the film, for one, she isn't even qualified for the job that she's supposed to do. And the city has shut down the social service program, which not only leaves Arthur without medication, but also her without work. She feels just as betrayed and left behind by the city as Arthur does. She does not look down on him. In fact, they're sitting in the same boat. Thomas Wayne also is a very realistic and believable character. He does behave like a politician who looks down on the rebellious civilians in his city with a very broad and overly simplistic lens. Much like Arthur, he has a very categorical view of the opposing force. And yes, he's a jerk, but he's also a dad who deeply cares about his son and his wife. And this is the central reason for why he decides to punch Arthur in the bathroom of the movie theater. Most fathers would have done the same thing when the weird guy that touched their son and attacked their butler showed up in front of them. He's not the cartoonish asshole character that some people make him out to be. Same goes for the guy who gave Arthur the gun and got him fired. Yes, he's kind of an asshole, but even he feels bad about it. And then he visits Arthur when his mother has died. So yeah, there's some compassion and some remorse for his actions. To be honest, there isn't a whole lot to talk about when it comes to the characters of Joker besides Arthur. The story, like I said previously, is deeply focused on his descent into Joker. It is a very introspective film, if you will, and we experience the entire film through Arthur's lens. There isn't a single scene that isn't presented from his POV, which is why the other characters are so strongly overshadowed by him. Still, even though it is a very introspective story about one guy, the supporting characters, as well as their interactions with Arthur, certainly have enough care put into them to make the story feel functional and compelling. The characters are certainly not a weak point of this film, contrary to the belief of many critics. Now, the Batman, on the other hand, has a whole bunch of excellent stuff going for many of its characters. Starting with Bruce, or more fittingly, Batman. He goes on a very compelling arc in this film, which slowly makes him question his methodology as a crime-fighting vigilante. At the beginning of the story, Batman is hell-bent on his ways of vengeance, and we see him fully engulfed in this persona. The typical duality between Batman and Playboy Bruce Wayne is nowhere to be found, because Batman is all that Bruce is, and all that he thinks he can be to save Gotham. Bruce believes that this is his family's legacy, without even thinking of financially supporting the city with all his inherited wealth.
What I'm doing is my family's legacy. If I can't change things here, if I can't have an effect, I don't care what happens to me.
He barely knows himself, and whenever we see him out of his costume, he doesn't act like a well-rounded person with a healthy and confident identity. There's no Bruce Wayne persona, it's just the Bat, and only the Bat. The fear aspect of Batman works very well, but in those 2 years of Batman being active, crime rates haven't declined in any way. Batman is not making the difference that he wants to see happen out of his actions. And that's because his narrow-minded approach isn't all that effective, which is shown by his horrible relationship with the Gotham police, as well as the city's civilians who are also afraid of him, even though he wants to help them. It seems like no one truly understands what Batman is actually about, which is then finally brought forth by the Riddler and his followers being directly inspired by Batman in their goal of creating chaos in Gotham City and ripping the entire system apart. And then finally, Bruce realizes that he needs to change his ways, that he needs to be a symbol of hope for the city and a symbol of fear for those threatening it. Especially the new mayor's attitude and the experience of saving people out of Square Garden show him that he needs to change his ways. This is the moment he realizes that his methods have been flawed, and that he needs to change up his approach in order to actually make Gotham a safer and better place for everyone. And we also have the reappearing son of the dead mayor, who keeps reinforcing Batman's motivation in a very subtle and profound way. Especially the first time Batman looks at him is a great little character moment. I really appreciate how deliberately the story ties into Batman's personal arc of changing his ways and gaining a better perspective on what he ought to do from now on. It's excellent stuff. However, while Batman's arc is incredibly well done, both in terms of his interactions with the people around him and the lessons he learns over the course of the film, I do have some pretty big issues with another aspect of how this young Batman is characterized. The first one being his incredibly narrow-minded and unintelligent strategic thinking. He simply walks into the iceberg launch through the main door and starts fighting everyone, instead of cleverly sneaking into the Penguin's office, like Batman would usually do. And later in the film, when fighting the many guys with the machine guns in the hallway, he also just walks up to them, tanks all of their bullets, and knocks them out with his fists. This is not how Batman would operate. I think it would be much better if he actually did something intelligent, instead of just brute forcing his way through every obstacle. But I can't really blame that on Batman's lack of intelligence, because in this movie, Batman is basically immune to all firearms. This is a very strong inconsistency that gets worse and worse as the film progresses. In the first fight, which is also my favorite scene in the entire film, one guy pulls out a gun, and Batman immediately focuses his attention on eliminating this threat as fast as he can. This makes it seem like guns pose a pretty notable threat to him, hence why he reacts so quickly to it. In the fight scene in the club, he gets hit by a shotgun shot, To be fair, it was quite far away from him, but it just pushes him back a bit, and that's it. At this point, his suit seems very resistant to firearms, which already greatly diminishes the incentive to be very careful and sneaky when dealing with armed threats. But then it gets much worse when he survives the explosion right in front of his face, and when he smashes his head straight into a bridge. And then we get to this admittedly extremely cool, but also unfortunately very stupid hallway scene. So these guys all have high caliber machine guns, and they should absolutely be much stronger and more deadly than the guns he was hit with before. And remember, those firearms did have somewhat of an impact on him. But in this scene, Batman tanks a gazillion bullets with ease, and he just casually walks up to the last two guys, who absolutely blast him with bullets, but he just keeps moving forward. How is that possible? His suit must be super advanced, not only because it can tank all of these shots, but there also needs to be some way for it to absorb the extreme recoil all of the bullets create. He doesn't seem bothered by almost anything. Same with the final action scene. Even though Batman's character arc is downright fantastic, his fighting strategy feels incredibly uncanny. This is not how Batman would operate in any case, even if he's still a young Batman. He is careful and reserved when handling a threat. This is the exact opposite of that. I think it was a very bad idea to make the Batsuit as indestructible as it is, because it removes a key element that makes Batman such a cool superhero to see in action. He isn't super powerful. Even with all his tech, he's just a mere human, and he can die very easily, which is precisely why he needs to rely on his intelligence and planning when fighting his opponents. But there's close to none of that in this movie. I deeply hope that the sequel will ground him in a way that actually makes him think about these things, so that we can see this awesome Batman do some cool action scenes as well. Not this stuff. This is pretty boring, and it doesn't fit with Batman's character to be so invulnerable. And unfortunately, this also goes for his detective work. To be fair, he does some pretty clever stuff in this film in figuring out the Riddler's riddles, but he gets so many clues that come totally random and out of the blue. Like the short meeting with Selina, or the random police officer when he figures out the last beat of the puzzle. It doesn't feel earned at all, which is quite unsatisfying. Although I must say that the detective stuff is much better than the action scenes. Not in terms of execution, but in terms of implications, concepts, and ideas. Another problem is the ambiguity of his no-kill rule, which we get very little of. He seems to be a bit more loose with it, especially concerning his behavior after the huge explosion and leaving Gordon to die in order to chase the Penguin. Granted, the film is not aware of that, but I really hope we get more on Batman's morality in the following films. The design of the Batsuit is extremely cool though, and I like the fact that they attempted to make a much more grounded version of Batman, except for, the very horrendous plot armor. And another brilliant thing is the visible stitching on the mask, which just makes it look super cool. So yeah, there are some blatant issues with the portrayal of Batman in this film, but most of that doesn't hit the core of his character, but rather certain attributes that leave a lot to be desired. But the foundation and the substance of his character is still completely functional, and pretty freaking great in my eyes. Next we have Selina, aka Catwoman. She's a really great character as well. She's the daughter of the biggest crime boss in Gotham City, and he never cared for her or fulfilled the father figure within her life. She feels betrayed by him, which we get a very clear picture of when she runs into him in the club, causing her a small mental breakdown. And therefore, she tries to steal some tiny amount of his gigantic pile of money to escape all of that crime and corruption of Gotham and start a new life somewhere else. And right as her girlfriend Annika is exposed for being the, mistress of the mayor, Selina decides that now is the right time to steal the money and get away from this place. When Batman visits her apartment, we also see many unpaid bills, which shows that she isn't simply greedy for her daddy's money, but has much more understandable motives. Her affection towards Batman also makes complete sense, given that she has great insight into all of the worst and dark corners of the city, and amongst all that, there is someone who deeply shares her disdain towards the corrupt system of Gotham. And when Annika is murdered by Falcone, she decides to enact vengeance on Falcone. But before she gets to finish him off, Bruce pulls her back, because he knows that it's only going to cause her more pain and turmoil. This is the best character moment between the two. It's very intimate and emotional, and the acting is great as well.
He has to pay!
You don't have to pay with him. You paid enough.
Yeah, she's pretty great. I really appreciate that this movie gave her much more of a character rather than her just being super flirty and seductive all the time. She actually has a lot going for her, and she might develop her typical sassy and self-confident and flirty attitude further down the line, but it seems like Selina Kyle also is in a very early stage of her character, which I think is pretty genius, since it will be very engaging to watch her develop alongside Batman. And I like that her suit is very simple and not as sexualized, plus the much less pronounced cat ears. It fits this grounded version of Batman quite well. Now, let's look at James Gordon. I really like his character. We don't get a lot of information on his past with Batman, but it is very clear that Gordon trusts him like 100%, to the point where it even feels kinda strange. Every other police cop is not fond of Batman, but Gordon still stays beside him and works with him. It's quite admirable actually, but I don't think this type of behavior would fly with the police. I think it's much more likely that they would excommunicate him from service, given how much he works with Batman. And again, it's great to see these characters in a much earlier stage of their development, as opposed to how we get to see them in the most common Batman media. Still, there are some issues with him, mostly regarding the fact that he didn't care that Batman just left him to die surrounded by all of these gunmen. They're basically pretty good friends at this point. But yeah, that's again a blatant flaw within the script itself that unfortunately doesn't get any recognition. Gordon's awesome. I think what they could do for later films is create a bit of conflict between Gordon and Batman, so that we get some more juicy character stuff out of their dynamic as well. This might be somewhat tough, because for now, Gordon is basically fully on Batman's side, but who knows, maybe they could come up with something pretty interesting. Alfred is also pretty fantastic in this movie. The dynamic between him and Bruce is rather cold and distanced. We only get about 4 to 5 scenes with him, and those scenes very clearly paint the picture of an Alfred that is very caring to Bruce, and that carries great respect for the Waynes. He acts as a small oasis of rationality for Bruce, like when he tells him that this current Batman is not what his parents would want to see in Bruce. And even though we only get very few scenes between the two, all of them are incredibly personal. They are part of my favorite scenes in the entire film, and certainly my favorite character scenes. I really like how Alfred is his own agent, with his own personal opinions on Batman. It makes for a greatly engaging and compelling relationship between him and Bruce. Especially the 2 scenes in the hospital are so well put together to deepen their relationship. Like, man, the moment when Bruce acknowledges and realizes that he's the only person that Alfred is close to, and just stares at him lying in the hospital bed, it's so good.
Is there anyone else to notify? Next of kin?
No. It's just me.
Yeah, like everyone else so far, Alfred is a pretty great character. So, let's talk about the worst character in the film, the Riddler. And before I go on a rant on why I dislike him so much more than the other characters, I'd like to point out the good and even the great stuff about him, because he's still a pretty great character. I love how intimidating he is. The costume, his over-the-top attitude, and most importantly, the extremely brutal method of killing his victims. You know, the rat cage that will make the rats slowly eat your face. Man, that's some fucked up stuff. He feels a lot more dangerous than the Riddler we usually get to see, and the videos of him talking to Batman and showing his victims remind me a lot of Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight. I also really enjoy all the riddles. They're all very cleverly constructed and are pretty different from one another. The worst one, or the least interesting one to me, is the one in the orphanage, where it's just the well-known saying, "The sins of the father are visited on the son." That one was super obvious. Okay, now on to the bad stuff. It mostly concerns the Riddler's motive and plan. So, because of his job, he came across all the corruption that was going on in the city, and therefore he decided to actively go after the top people in the system and basically kill them. So from that, we have a very clear picture of his motives. He has an extreme distaste for every corrupt person in the city, and is willing to resort to highly malicious and immoral methods to fight against the system. His view of reality is very much false, but there seems to be a method to the madness. He only goes after people who he considers to be very evil and corrupt. But as soon as the Riddler decides to kill Bruce Wayne, because in his mind he should pay for his father having killed a reporter, this very consistent and understandable motive starts to get a bit out of whack. As far as his view on the world is concerned, Bruce doesn't deserve to die. This is a bit of a reach, and the only justification one might come up with is that there's a huge personal grudge the Riddler holds against him, since both of them were orphans, but the public, and basically everyone, only cared about the poor and lonely son of the Waynes, while the Riddler was basically ignored. That could be a reason for it. But afterwards, the Riddler then plans on flooding the city and having his followers shoot the new mayor. But why? He knows which people are bad and corrupt, and which ones aren't. So why exactly target the new mayor, who seems to be a very virtuous person with a strong sense of how broken the current system is? She very clearly wants to change things for the better. And then the Riddler tries to assassinate her? What? Besides that, the flooding of the city will harm and kill many innocent people. But that doesn't seem to be his plan at the end. His followers are supposed to position themselves in Square Garden and shoot at people indiscriminately, it seems like. So at first, the Riddler tried to send a message by killing all of the corrupt people in power, and then at the end, he just says fuck it and floods the entire city? What the hell is your deal? This doesn't line up at all with the character we got to know in the first 2 hours of the film. It's very strange that at first, the Riddler seems very deliberate and careful with all of his targets, and then just lets his followers go ham on innocent civilians. And you're telling me that this guy and his followers were inspired by Batman? You know what? On that note, all this time, the Riddler thought that Batman was actually on his team, and that he had similar motives to himself. He thought that they were striving towards the same end goal. But this is stupid. How did the Riddler get the impression that Batman is cool with him killing innocent people and destroying Gotham entirely? Batman very clearly works with the police and cares about fighting crime. Riddler, besides his obvious mental issues, seems to be a highly intelligent individual. He alone managed to get behind the entire corrupt system of Gotham and prepared this extremely elaborate plan. So how would he be that delusional when it comes to Batman's intentions? Up until the final piece of the plan, the Riddler was a very interesting and consistent villain with a flawed but consistent motivation. But this final bit is a complete middle finger to all of the intentionality and deliberateness that his plan had before. Oh, and how could I forget the infamous wailing scene? Why did they do that? It sounds way too funny, and immediately makes him so much less intimidating. This interrogation scene alone does some pretty substantial damage to his character. And then he also starts singing Ave Maria, which is even more laughable. I really don't get why they decided to portray him in that way. He comes off way too goofy in this scene. I think the idea of having a villain be completely inspired by the hero is very interesting, especially for a Batman story.
I'm vengeance. I'm vengeance.
The execution, however, does fall on its face quite a bit. Still, I think the Riddler is a pretty good villain overall. It's just a shame how he was damaged in the last 40 minutes of the movie. At some point, I might do an episode completely dedicated to the Batman and its biggest issues, and how they could be fixed to make this movie truly phenomenal. But I'll do that some other time. Let's move on. The Penguin. Well, what do you want me to say? This guy is fucking great. It's pretty much a perfect portrayal of the Penguin's mannerisms and overall appearance. And he also somewhat functions as a comedic character, which is a very much appreciated change from everything else in this film. There's of course the very stupid thing of him not being arrested by the police for causing the car explosion, and then afterwards carelessly shooting around a crowded street filled with non-corrupt cops. Like, man, you should be in jail so many times over, my dude. But at the end of the film, he's still not in jail. It's absurd. Still, awesome character. And the final character I want to talk about is Falcone, who is not as fleshed out as everyone else, but he still works super well as the #1 crime boss of Gotham City. And I like how untouchable and invulnerable he feels when talking to everyone. He acts like he sees himself as some form of a king, looking down on everyone else. And I really like the moment when he tells Batman that no one will dare to put him in jail, because he deeply believes that he owns the city entirely.
It's coming out. Let me tell you something. Whatever I know, whatever I've done, it's all going with me to my grave. What are you with Zorro over here? Don't you know you boys in blue work for me?
But then he's shown wrong when all the non-corrupt police officers appear on the street, ready to arrest him. Comparing the two, I think it's very obvious which one of these runs superior. Joker does have some pretty good characters, and they work perfectly for the story that the film is trying to tell, and the message it's trying to get across. However, the Batman simply excels at character. It is quite amazing actually how great all of the central characters are. And despite all of its other very amazing qualities, which we definitely get to, I think that the best aspect of this entire film are the characters. And that's great, cause I value character over plot and script. It's not a huge difference, but character surely is the more important aspect of the two, in my opinion. So let's talk about the acting. And I think it's pretty safe to say that amongst all the performances in both films, Joaquin Phoenix definitely steals the show. His performance as Arthur makes the entire movie so much better. It's super impressive. He completely disappears into this psychotic and mentally unstable character, and he is the best part of the entire film. Same goes for Frances Conroy, Brett Cullen, and of course Robert De Niro. They're all doing a fantastic job with what they're given, which admittedly is not that much. There's not a single performance in this film that I'd call bad, at least not from the most prominent characters. So yeah, pretty good stuff. The Batman kind of trumps this though. Robert Pattinson as Batman is so freaking great. I really like him as Batman. He does an excellent job at communicating Batman's thoughts and mindset with the smallest nuances in his expression and body language. It's pretty excellent. His presence in the calmer and character-focused scenes of the film is very strong. And I also love how normal his voice sounds compared to the last two versions of Batman we saw on the big screen. And again, I really enjoy how he acts in conjunction with Andy Serkis. My heart is still very much tied to Christian Bale, because he's one of my favorite actors of all time. But I think once I see this film and the following films some more, Robert Pattinson will easily take the place of my favorite Batman on screen. When Pattinson becomes a more mature and experienced Batman, he will be phenomenal, and maybe the best Batman we've ever seen. Zoe Kravitz also does an awesome job as Catwoman. Her emotional moments are super good, and she communicates the typical characteristics and attributes of Catwoman in a much more subtle way. Yeah, all around a great performance. I really hope we get to see more of her in Batman. Jeffrey Wright does a great job as James Gordon. The one scene that comes to mind is the fake argument they're having in the interrogation cell to sort of appease Gordon's police colleagues after telling them to leave the room. They pretend to be angry at each other, but they are actually exchanging information and just acting out an argument. And it's pretty great.
We gotta get you out of here.
I'll put a lot of heat on you.
Oh, you punched me in the face. Take this key. Through that door. All the way to the stairs that go to the roof.
All the interactions he has with Batman are really cool. And I especially enjoy his reactions to all of the Riddler's crazy puzzles and riddles.
Thumb drive.
Jesus. Oh, this guy's hilarious. What kind of demented son of a bitch does this to a person? Jesus, his next victim is Bruce Wayne. Jesus.
I think Gary Oldman in the Dark Knight trilogy is freaking amazing. I really enjoy the conflict and the opposing viewpoints he has compared to Batman, but I'm also very happy with this casting choice, and I'm eager to see how he develops. Casting Andy Serkis as Alfred was a great decision. He brings a ton of emotional depth to Alfred's character, and like I said, the few interactions he has with Robert Pattinson's Bruce/Batman are super compelling to watch, both because of the script, but also because of the great performances. I really hope that Andy gets more screen time and exploration of his character in the next film, because the Bruce-Alfred relationship has always been something extremely intriguing to me in almost all Batman stories. It has so much potential, and with him in the role, they could do some pretty amazing stuff. Paul Dano's portrayal of the Riddler is also pretty good. Everything up until the interrogation scene is pretty great. He's scary, somewhat theatrical and extravagant when he puts on the Riddler persona for the public. But in the one scene in which his character is the focus, he does this cartoonish wailing and singing, which is just so strange. This has not much to do with Dano's performance though. He does a great job with the stuff he is given, and the casting also fits pretty well. He really appears like someone who has had a very rough childhood, and who works a job that is highly focused on numbers, and who's also very intelligent, but also very crazy. And now we get to freaking Colin Farrell as the Penguin. Man, what a phenomenal performance. Before going into the movie, I knew that he would be playing the Penguin, but as soon as I saw the makeup, I just failed to see him at all. It was just the Penguin, and boy does he do a great job with this material. It's such a great performance in every aspect. He's funny, his facial expressions and the way he speaks his lines, his accent, it's all so the Penguin. It's almost too good to be true. Great job, Pharrell. And then we have John Turturro, who also does an amazing job playing Falcone. Not much else to say here, honestly. It's just a really good performance. Everyone does a great job. I think the Batman has an obvious advantage over Joker here, simply because there are much more relevant and highly unique characters in it. Overall, the acting in both films is of amazing quality. And while the Batman has a bigger caliber of great actors playing great characters, Joker has the insane talent and dedication of Joaquin Phoenix, who undoubtedly steals the show. Next, we'll look at one of the strong points of both movies, the cinematography. The two words I'd use to describe the look of Joker would be raw and imposing. From the mostly green, yellow and blue color palette that the entire city feels drenched in, to the sometimes tilted, very slowly and deliberately moving camera, it complements the film incredibly well. Just by the shots that I'm showing you right now, there is a very strong personality present in every camera pan, close-up and wide shot. There's pleasant mix between handheld and static camera in the film, and again I want to stress the very regularly used slow zoom-ins and zoom-outs. It's all done very well, and the colors have a very distinct quality to them. The film looks incredibly unique, and at many points, especially during daytime, the colors kinda seem to blend into each other and don't have a lot of contrast. That's mostly due to the natural lighting. But when artificial lighting comes into play, the colors look so much more vibrant and beautiful. There are tons of beautiful shots in this film, and you are currently seeing some of my favorites on screen. The film all around is super well shot. Now, the Batman. Hoo boy, where do I begin? One thing that sticks out the most to me is that many shots use a very low depth of field, which causes some parts of the image being out of focus, creating a very distinct feel. Personally, I think it looks really freaking cool. And it helps in many of the scenes to fully zoom in and focus on one face or one specific aspect of the image that the film wants you to pay attention to, like for example in the tear shot. I really like the shot of the reflection of Gordon and Batman on the car as they are entering the former mayor's garage. The look of the fight scene in the iceberg lounge is super awesome. All the shots of him on the construction building with the bat signal on it, especially those where we only see his silhouette, look so awesome as well. And they are a great visual representation of Batman being the shadows of the city. Also, of course, the upside down shot of him stepping out of the Batmobile, and the hallway fight scene with Falcone's guards. The shot from outside the cafe with the Riddler sitting at the table also looks very incredible, and the top-down shot where Batman leads the crowd of civilians through the water, holding a red fuse of light, is also very beautiful. This movie looks absolutely gorgeous. And I can't talk about this film's cinematography without mentioning the super creative shots where the camera is hooked onto something, like in the car chase, where they are hooked onto the wheels of the cars, or the shot of Batman holding the grappling hook as it pulls him up the staircase of the GCPD. Aside from that, the color red regularly pops up in the film, and every time it illuminates the Batsuit in a very cool way. This mix of the vibrant red with the dark black color of the suit looks awesome. And this is obviously also the color combination that is used in all of the promotional material and the posters of the film. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear cut to say that the Batman cinematography is superior to Joker's. And this might somewhat come down to personal preference, but when looking at all the creativity and diversity of all the framing methods used in the Batman, and when comparing the best looking shots of both films, I think there's a pretty strong case in favor of the Batman, all things considered. And still, both films look terrific in their own right. But come on, the Batman's just better. Come on. So, let's talk music. Joker's musical score is amazing. There is a very strong emphasis on the cello, and as Arthur dives deeper and deeper into his dark side, coming closer and closer to the Joker inside him, the music gets stronger, louder and more pronounced with every track. It's like the chaos and hatred inside him is growing hand in hand with the music. It's pretty beautiful. I think Joker's soundtrack is even better than its cinematography. And what's pretty interesting is that The score for this film was finished without the composer knowing any detail of the film's plot.
I wrote quite a lot of the music before they started shooting, so the music influenced the performance quite a bit.
The score was already completely done, and I really believe that the excellence of the score had a notable impact on the rest of Joker's production. I'm assuming that, because of how incredibly well everything matches together, the soundtrack perfectly complements the visuals and the entire story of Arthur. My top 3 pieces are Arthur Comes to Sophie, Call Me Joker, and of course, Bathroom Dance. Yeah, the soundtrack is just amazing from front to back, and together with Joaquin Phoenix's performance, is the most memorable element of the entire film. Well, the Batman score is just as great as Joker's score, which already is an impressive feat. First off, the Batman theme is so fucking cool, oh my god. Generally speaking, the score of this film is much more theatrical and grandiose, and the tracks offer a nice variety in atmosphere and tone. I love Selina's theme, how it's much more warm and peaceful compared to the rest of the music. And the Riddler's theme is also very cool, with the female voice. It's very creepy. The score builds suspense extremely well. It's really freaking good. The tracklist is super long, and it's all around an amazing album to listen to. My top 3 pieces of this soundtrack are Mayoral Ducting, The Batman, and Catwoman. Especially the Catwoman theme I like a lot. It feels incredibly unique in the entirety of the score, and all the Riddler related tracks, plus the one that play in the action scenes, and the few tracks that aren't Batman related at all, but focus more on Bruce Wayne and also Alfred and the other characters. It's just all around an amazing soundtrack, with lots of different tones and leitmotifs that come together to create a whole. Comparing the two is extremely tough. They are incredible and I love listening to both. Generally, it's safe to say that the Batman offers much more variety in its tracks, because of the many relevant characters within the world. Joker's soundtrack is much more consistent in terms of tone when listening to it all the way through. Unlike the Batman, which has many different themes and leitmotifs, and just a variety of tones, Joker only has one leitmotif, the slow, tortured and haunting cello. And this of course makes perfect sense, considering that the entire film is happening from Arthur's POV. This doesn't mean that one is better than the other at all. It's actually a great plus for both films. The scores fit the focus of their individual stories and characters extremely well. Man, I admire the fact that we have modern movies like this, that actually care for having a unique and good score that complements their other qualities. Soundtrack is really important, and I feel many films might underestimate how much a good score can do for your film in terms of atmosphere and narrative. I think Joker again is much more tonally consistent, simply because of how focused the film is on Arthur's descent into Joker. And for that reason, I value it a bit more in terms of a complete musical craft of its own. The Batman score, however, doesn't function as well on its own. Many of the tracks do for sure, and there's so much good stuff here. Especially when looking at how the tracks vary from suspenseful, imposing and ominous, creepy and dangerous, and heartfelt and emotional. But it's definitely not as, let's say, smooth of a listen through compared to the Joker's soundtrack. Man, this is hard. I really don't know which one to choose. I don't want to. On the one hand, I love so many tracks of the Batman soundtrack, because they're all so unique and just so beautiful. But I also really respect the completeness of the entire Joker score. It's so dark and tragic, but also incredibly threatening and haunting. Fuck, I can't decide. They're both amazing. Yeah, I don't know. I can't decide. Both have their own unique qualities that make them phenomenal musical scores. Nevertheless, I think we can be extremely thankful that there are still directors and creative voices out there that actually value the importance of a good musical score accompanying their film. And both Joker and Batman are prime examples of how great the result of that effort and devotion to the craft can be. And now we get to how these films portray and characterize the city which they take place in, Gotham City. Joker's Gotham is about 40 to 50 years younger than the Gotham of the Batman. And we see this illustrated quite well. The shops on the streets, the theaters, the taxis, the people, it all emphasizes the 70s vibe the film is going for. Interestingly, even the color palette and the look of the film feels somewhat older. The image doesn't have that completely clean and polished modern Hollywood look to it. It feels much more at home with actual film. But let's go back to Gotham itself. The streets, the subway, the buildings, everything is very dour and dirty. Joker emphasizes on the ugliness of Gotham's exterior, which is also reflected by the majority of its citizens, or at least those we get to see throughout the film. Almost nothing, aside from Wayne Manor and the Gotham Theater for the rich, looks glamorous or pretty. 95% of Gotham is a complete shithole. In terms of aesthetic and architecture, there's nothing too special or praiseworthy about the look of the city. But there's also nothing that feels weird or uncanny about it either. The city, as it's portrayed in this film, could very well be Gotham City. But since the movie is much more centered around the people within the city, we don't get to see much of it. And what we get to see is basically just New York in the 1970s. It's basically the city of Taxi Driver. And that's fine, it works great for this film. But it's not that much Gotham. If it wasn't for the people and the conflict between the rich and the civilians, this city would have nothing unique to offer. The Batman's Gotham, however, is on a completely different level. This version of Gotham fires on all cylinders. The most beautiful and unique thing about it is the traditional Victorian architecture of the buildings, giving the city a somewhat mythical, noble, and elegant aesthetic. And we also get a look at the inside of Gotham's homes and mansions. The old furniture, the interior design of the rooms, and the old school lamps all fit perfectly with the old Victorian buildings of Gotham. And the film goes to great lengths in order to show us all of that beautiful architecture throughout the story. Everything about the city's exterior and interior feels deliberately crafted to fit this new Batman franchise, and I absolutely adore it. If the Gotham of Joker was ugly, filthy, and full of misery, the Batman's Gotham is old, almost ancient in spirit, but at the same time, totally molested and abused by modern technology. We see Gotham Square, with all those screens put over its old European buildings. And even though the city is modernized and digitalized, nothing feels airbrushed or clean. Even the technology that Batman uses, from the screens to his gear and his Batmobile, it's all Gothamized in a sense. And this is such an amazing concept. The idea that even though no city of the developed worlds can outrun digitalization and modernization, Gotham's essence and aura is so omnipresent that it refuses to be overshadowed by the bright screens and the modern skyscrapers. But this is only one facet of how Gotham is being damaged. The immense corruption that pulses through every street and every corner of the city, the crime lords who are full of greed and who leech off of the massive financial funds of the city to keep their empire alive and thriving are even worse. This Gotham has a real character on its own. Even without the people living in it and all the corruption, Catwoman, Batman, the Riddler, just the look of it shows how old the city is and how much of a history it has. It's the perfect mix of modern, grounded, and more outlandish and stylized elements. I love this version of Gotham so damn much. It's pretty much perfect. Like I said, it truly fires on all cylinders. So, before we wrap up, I'd just like to mention some other stuff that I couldn't quite fit into any of the categories. I think it was an interesting choice to have Joker be somewhat of a victim of his environment throughout most of the film. If we compare this to the intimidating and threatening comic character, there is a very strong difference in behavior and abilities. Arthur isn't really all that intimidating. Even at the end of the film, he doesn't really feel like the Joker. And that's definitely deliberate. The entire point behind this film is not to tell the origin of the Joker, but to show how someone, if pushed far enough, can develop a similar mindset. This is why the film is called Joker and not The Joker. I also really like that one transition of Arthur standing in front of his boss, and as the camera keeps zooming in on his face, he starts smiling stronger and stronger, and we start hearing him kicking the bag of trash. I think it's a pretty effective transition. Another thing about Joker, there's actually a lot of intentionality behind the execution of many scenes, in terms of content, framing, symbols, and so on. Take for example the first scene of him laughing while he's talking to the social worker. It's very painful, and it's obviously caused by his condition. But at the end of the film, when he talks to a different psychiatrist or social worker, he laughs because he enjoys himself. It's not painful at all. He celebrates what he has become, and there is no pain to be found. In a similar vein, there are many shots in the film with stairs, and all the time it's framed in a negative way. Arthur is struggling to walk up these stairs, but all the time he's walking down the stairs, he's actually very happy, and the scenes have a very different tone, meaning that walking up the stairs kind of represents his struggle, while every time he walks down the stairs, it's easy, and he feels good. These are just a few touches that the film intentionally focuses on to put all these little pieces into a perfectly fitting picture. It's very, very intentional, just like the Batman. The sound design of the Batman is fucking insane. It's so good. Especially all of the sounds of Batman's gadgets are very pronounced. It immerses you even more into the film. I appreciate how they intentionally draw a parallel between Batman and the Riddler by first showing the Riddler spying on the mayor's home, and later they do the same thing with Batman spying on Selina. It's a very clever way of emphasizing the theme of the film. I really appreciate it. And one last thought on the overall theme and character arcs of these two films. They do have some similarities. Both protagonists are part of an environment that is evil and malicious towards them, and while Arthur lets himself get absorbed into all of that negativity and finally violently lashes out against everyone who has been treating him poorly, Bruce decides to take on the difficult path of fighting the evil and bad corruption within the city, changing it for the better in the correct and moral way. Arthur surrenders himself to the evil and dark thoughts of his, because that's the only thing he has left. It is the only thing that people appreciate him for in the end, and it's the one thing that he ultimately becomes. But Bruce fights it. He fights for a future without suffering and violence, while Joker uses those exact methods to love in the face of Gotham and the entire world. And interestingly, when both characters come to realize the impact they have on the people around them, in that Arthur is celebrated by the people of Gotham for his brutal crime, and Batman understands that the path of vengeance he was walking on led to even more chaos and evil. But while Arthur takes the symbolic power he has and fully embraces it, Batman changes his ways for the better and tries to be a symbol of hope for the city, while Arthur becomes a symbol of chaos and hate. So, now I have to come to some sort of a conclusion. And after looking at everything, from the story to the presentation, I personally enjoy and appreciate the Batman over Joker. The main reasons for that being the depth and the complexity of its characters, the amazing visuals, the amazing sound design, and the lens it brings to the Batman franchise. However, if one might look at it objectively, there is a pretty strong argument to say that Joker is the superior film, because of all the pretty substantial plot issues and inconsistencies of the Batman. While Joker is an all-around super well-crafted film in every aspect, the various elements of the Batman fluctuate a bit more in quality. But then again, the style and the set design is undoubtedly superior to Joker. This is really tough, honestly, because the Batman's highs hit much higher than Joker's. However, its lows are also much more noticeable. I personally get much more out of watching the Batman, but that's ultimately really up to one's own subjective values. For me, character is definitely more important than plot. Plus, the amazing presentation of the Batman just makes it a bit better in my perspective. But this could really go either way. Well, that took us quite some time. But I'm glad we got to talk about those two films, because I admire their existence, and the fact that more creative and artistic films are still appreciated in today's climate of soulless Hollywood blockbusters and movies that function much more as products rather than actual pieces of art. In terms of a number score that I'd give these two films, I think, objectively speaking, I would give both of them between a 6 and a 7. I'm not entirely sure on that, but I think they're leaning towards a 7 rather than a 6. Like I said, personally, the Batman just resonates with me a whole lot more, but I still really enjoy Joker. that's my scoring for these films, at least for now. This might change in the future when I give these a bit more thought, but for now I'm leaning towards a 7 out of 10 for both of these. It's also very interesting to think that DC was doing so horrible just like 6 years ago, and now we're getting some pretty amazing films out of DC, and Marvel is kind of going down the shitter. Yeah, but the whole Marvel thing and the MCU and Phase 4, that will be an entirely different discussion that I might talk on sometime, but not right now. So, that's been it for this episode, guys. Like I said, I will be talking about the Batman some other time, because I still have a lot to say on that front. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.